So, something that I have noticed a lot as a day one Honkai Star Rail player is that some characters are met with quite a bit of skepticism from the player base at large. It might be a personal favorite that never ended up getting a dedicated support to allow them to perform at their fullest potential, or it might be someone with limitations in their kit that are considered to be unappealing. But today, I want to focus on Jiaoqiu. It's mostly because I find it fascinating to see how player sentiment has changed over time, but I also wanted to explore the generational damage that this man has done to the player base as a whole. So without further ado, let's get started with the infamous Hot Pot Man. Now, I think Jiaoqiu released during an interesting time. When he came out in 2024, the game was gradually starting to push out concrete team archetypes with stuff like DOT, Follow Up, and Super Break. But at the same time, because the overall roster was still fairly small compared to today, a lot of people found generalist supports to be valuable. Basically, if you were a limited Harmony character and you worked well with a variety of different teams, you were destined for success. And of course, it also helped if you were a female character. On the other hand, Jiaoqiu had all of these things going against him. Jiaoqiu was not very versatile. Sure, he has DOT in his kit, but the damage was not meaningful until you got his E2, and using him as a DOT character was an afterthought to most people. He also had vulnerability in his kit and his light cone, but Harmony character buffs were more powerful in comparison. This meant that to most people, the one thing that stood out for Jiaoqiu is that he was an excellent Acheron support. In other words, he was a niche support in an environment where people value versatility and flexibility. Not everyone is able to pull every single archetype that existed, so being able to mix and match supports was really important. The endgame content back then also wasn't hard enough to really emphasize the need for a support character that only did one job really well. So in a way, you could say that Jiaoqiu was ahead of his time. And of course, he had the misfortune of being a male character. Now, being male probably didn't matter to you if you played the game purely for meta reasons, or you might even be a based husbando enjoyer yourself. But on the other hand, I have encountered a fair amount of people that would simply refuse to pull Jiaoqiu for their Acheron purely because he was male. Hell, that might even be you watching this video right now. But I will say, to give Jiaoqiu credit, he definitely did his job. At the time of his release, he was the only character that also allowed your Acheron to generate stacks when enemies took action. This increased the amount of Acheron ultimates that you can use, which allowed her to clear endgame very comfortably. Keep in mind that back then, the HP inflation in endgame was nowhere near where it is today, so Acheron's raw damage was fine. Jiaoqiu was there to improve Acheron's ultimate frequency, which was the limiting factor. Unfortunately, as time went on, changes in the endgame environment became unfavorable for Jiaoqiu, and it wasn't just HP inflation. The game also started to introduce enemies that took away Jiaoqiu's one advantage over his Nihility peers. You see, these bosses had summons that didn't actually take action by themselves. So when being reactive and waiting for enemies to take action was no longer preferable, you basically took away Jiaoqiu's only unique advantage. And of course, as time went on, HP inflation continued to outpace the amount of damage amp that Jiaoqiu had, so Acheron owners continued to look for the next best thing. Tribi was a major addition for Acheron during her release, especially at E1 and in AoE environments. But what happened next is probably the most infamous time period that Honkai Star Rail players, especially Acheron mains, had the pleasure to experience. When Cypher was released during her pre-release period, people went crazy. And in case you weren't around during that time, just know that the discussion between Jiaoqiu and Cypher produced some pretty peak content, and a lot of it came from the Acheron main subreddit. I picked out a few of my personal favorites here. Ironically, from my perspective, the true winner of the fight between Cypher and Jiaoqiu was actually E2 Silverwolf after her Nova Flare happened. E2 Silverwolf allowed any ally attack to generate stacks for Acheron, which is the opposite of how Jiaoqiu generated stacks by relying on enemy actions. The proactive nature of E2 Silverwolf, combined with the attack frequency of teammates like Tribi, supercharged Acheron's ultimate frequency, not to mention that Silverwolf's own debuffs were really great as well, especially since her ultimate can now hit all enemies instead of just being a single target hit. And now that the official early access preview videos of Mortonak's Blade are out, It looks like we will finally have one character that will combine the many aspects of his predecessors into a single package, along with a high amount of overall damage amplification. I think Mortonak's Blade may very well be the turning point for Acheron owners everywhere, and I genuinely hope that he has the staying power to go along with it. But at the end of it all, what did it cost us? I think there are quite a few things that I still see in Honkai Star Rail discussions to this day, and I think they can all be traced back to Jiaoqiu. Let's take a look. When Jiaoqiu first came out, it was the first time that many players got to experience what a niche support is like. Sure, we have Ranmei that was well known for Super Break early on, and we also had Robin that was a must-have for follow-up. But both of those premium supports were also flexible enough to be used in teams outside of their intended archetypes. Harmony Support Rail was the name of the game. All of this meant that the player base was not ready for a niche support, and when someone like Jiaoqiu is the first concrete introduction of this concept, the feedback was definitely bad. This was also during a time when 4-star characters were used a lot more often in endgame content, so you would hear people say things like, "I'll just get by with Pella," or maybe things like, "Jiaoqiu only works with Acheron, so I would rather get a generalist support that can work with Acheron and everyone else that I own." Now, regardless of how well these statements still hold up today, I personally believe from that point on, a lot of people probably started to look at niche supports in a negative way. This became very apparent to me when Ceridra first came out. She had two very obvious DPS options that benefited from her existence, but she was definitely not a generalist support that worked with every team. People saw the Jiaoqiu within her to the point that similar meme artwork was also made for Ceridra as well. I think people today are a lot more accepting of Ceridra's ability to duplicate skills, but in the back of their minds, I'm also sure that some of these same people might be afraid that Ceridra is just one patch away from being replaced by a different support, just like what Jiaoqiu is going through. They're afraid that their PoE investment will be wasted on her. To a lesser extent, there was also a similar feeling with Cyrene's release as well. On the one hand, she's able to support a lot more characters than Ceridra did during her release. On the other hand, the specialized buffs are only for Chrysal's heirs. I felt a very similar sentiment from people during her release. For some people, they might think that Cyrene's buffs are too limiting and niche. Or, to echo an earlier sentiment from people that were comfortable with using Pella with their Acheron back during version 2, some people may also believe that Cyrene is a luxury option and that she is not a necessity for the teams that she supports. Again, from my perspective, I feel that some people might be afraid that a niche option will become obsolete too soon, and that their investment will end up becoming a waste. I will mention that both Ceridra and Cyrene do have uses beyond their intended niche, but I will save that topic for another day. In any case, I think this is the kind of generational damage that all started with Jiaoqiu, and I don't blame people for having that kind of sentiment. I think it makes sense that people would rely on their past experiences to dictate their future actions. And from that perspective, I'm not surprised by the reactions that even newer niche support characters seem to have gotten over the past year. But here's something that I think more people should realize. At some point, all characters will fall out of favor, especially if they're going to stay at E0. I understand the worry that sometimes a character might seem too specialized, and you're worried about their longevity. But regardless of all of that, I am personally someone that is willing to go the extra mile for a team that I like to play. Even if a niche support ends up becoming the next Jiaoqiu, I know in my heart that I did everything that I could for my Acheron, and that I've been able to allow my favorite team to perform as well as it did for the time that those supports were relevant for. And honestly, even if Jiaoqiu is currently underperforming when compared to the other Nihility options, I personally do not regret it. The background footage is all with my own Jiaoqiu. After all, I do have him at E1S1, along with 180 effect hit rate and 157 plus speed with 4-piece Eagle and 2-piece Von Whack. So it's definitely not for a lack of trying. I really hope that a good Nova Flare will come for Jiaoqiu one day, because I think he can really use a buff. But until then, I hope that Mortonak's Blade can live up to the hype. And while I am willing to face the reality of Jiaoqiu's situation, the fact that he has served Acheron for as long as he did is something that I will never forget. Jiaoqiu walked so that his successors could run, and for that, I thank him for his service. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like. If you have your own experiences with Jiaoqiu or other niche supports that you would like to share, feel free to post your thoughts in the comments below. If you're interested in commentary videos like these, along with guides and gameplay impressions for Honkai Star Rail, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out. I also stream on Twitch on a weekly basis with a focus on endgame. So if you're curious, I left the link in the description below for you to check out. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all on the next one.